In the back rooms of a Georgia plantation, sometime in the 1840s, a white mistress went into labor while the master was away. No doctor was sent for, no church bell rang, no record was ever written. Only enslaved people were allowed in the room to witness the birth. By morning, the mother survived, the slaves were sent back to work, and the child was never seen again. This is not a ghost story. This is a disappearance buried inside history, and a silence that still lingers. Before we continue, welcome to Midnight Epoch, a place where history's silences are given a voice. If you are drawn to forgotten stories, buried truths, and the dark corners history tried to hide, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon, and stay with us until the very end. And when this story is complete, leave a comment telling us just how deeply it held you. The night the mistress went into labor did not announce itself with urgency. There was no sudden rush through the house, no frantic call for a physician, no lanterns waving in the yard to summon help. Instead, it arrived quietly, almost cautiously, as though even the night itself understood that this was something meant to remain contained. It was late, well past the hour when the plantation typically surrendered to sleep. The master was away, gone for days, perhaps weeks, and his absence created a fragile, dangerous vacuum. Without him, the household existed in a strange in-between state, still bound by his authority, but lacking his presence to enforce it directly. Decisions that might have been straightforward under his watch now carried risk. And none carried more risk than this. The mistress had felt the pains begin just after sunset. At first, she dismissed them, pacing her room in silence, gripping the edge of her bed until her knuckles whitened. She had been through childbirth before, and, as if the body itself hesitated, between contractions the mistress spoke, not to anyone in particular, but into the air itself. "He must never be known," she whispered once, gripping the sheets. "No one can know," she said again later, tears streaking down her temples. The women exchanged brief glances, careful not to linger. They understood secrecy, they lived inside it. But this was different. This secrecy was sharp, edged with panic rather than control. As the night deepened, the candles began to sputter, not from lack of wax, but from sudden, unexplained drafts that moved through the sealed room. Shadows jumped along the walls. One woman crossed herself instinctively before catching herself and lowering her hand. When the moment finally came, it came abruptly. The mistress's body convulsed with a strength born of desperation rather than rhythm. Her screams tore through the room, raw and unrestrained, and then, suddenly, it was over. The child was born into silence. No immediate cry filled the air. No instinctive wail broke the tension. For one stretched, unbearable moment, the only sound was the crackle of candle flames and the mistress's ragged breathing. One of the women lifted the baby, expecting, praying, for that familiar sound. It did not come, but the child was alive. Its eyes were open. That alone was unusual enough to freeze the room. Newborns did not look like this. They did not focus. They did not watch. Yet this child's gaze moved slowly, deliberately, settling on faces one by one, as if taking inventory. A chill moved through the women, raising the fine hairs along their arms. The mistress saw the child then, truly saw it, and something inside her broke. She did not reach out. She did not smile. She recoiled, pulling herself back against the pillows, a sound escaping her throat. That was not quite a scream and not quite a sob. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." The women hesitated, uncertain what to do. This was the moment that usually brought relief, celebration even, a life successfully delivered. Instead, the room felt heavier than it had all night. "Take it," the mistress finally said, her voice trembling. "Take it away from me." Dawn was still hours away, but the night had shifted. Something irreversible had occurred. One of the women wrapped the child in cloth, her hands shaking despite years of experience. She expected resistance, crying, something. There was none. Before anyone could ask questions, not that they would have dared, the mistress gave new orders. Everyone was to leave the room except one man, a trusted enslaved servant who had worked in the house for years, chosen for his silence rather than his loyalty. The women were ushered out, one by one, warned again never to speak of what they had seen. The door closed behind them, shutting in the mistress, the man, and the child. By the time the sun rose over the fields, the enslaved women were back at work as if nothing had happened. The plantation woke to an ordinary morning. Breakfast was prepared, orders were given, life continued, but something was missing. No announcement was made, no cries echoed from the house. No sign of a newborn appeared in the days that followed. The child born that night was never seen again, and that silence, deliberate, heavy, absolute, was only the beginning. The silence that followed the birth did not end with the closing of the bedroom door. It spread outward, seeping into the walls of the house, into the hallways, into the routines that resumed with unsettling speed the very next morning. From the outside, the plantation appeared unchanged. Smoke rose from the kitchen chimney. Tools were gathered, orders were spoken. But beneath that familiar rhythm ran a current of unease that those who lived inside the house could feel with every step. Enslaved women who had been present during the birth did not speak of it openly. They understood instinctively that some moments were dangerous to name, yet silence does not erase memory. It sharpens it. Each woman carried fragments of the night with her, the mistress's words, the way the candles flickered, the unnatural stillness of the child. These fragments surfaced in glances exchanged across the yard, in pauses that lingered too long, in the careful avoidance of certain rooms in the house. What troubled them most was not simply that the child was gone, but how completely it had vanished. There was no sign that a birth had occurred at all. No bloodied linens were aired, no cradle appeared, no special meals were prepared for the recovering mother. It was as if the night had been folded in on itself and hidden away. The mistress did not summon the women again. She remained confined to her room, claiming weakness, though no one was permitted to attend her directly. Meals were left outside the door. Messages were relayed through intermediaries. When she did speak, it was brief, sharp, and delivered with an intensity that discouraged further interaction. Yet those who cleaned the house noticed small things that unsettled them. The sheets from the berth were not washed. They were burned. The hearth in the back courtyard smoked for hours that morning, long after the fire should have died. The smell lingered, not the clean scent of ash, but something heavier, something that clung to the air. At night, the house behaved differently. Floorboards creaked where no one walked. Doors that had been closed were found slightly ajar. Candles burned down faster than expected, their wax pooling in strange, uneven shapes. The enslaved servants assigned to nighttime duties began inventing excuses to avoid certain corridors, especially those beneath the mistress's chambers. They spoke quietly among themselves, always careful of who might be listening. Some believed the child had been quietly sent away, hidden with distant relatives perhaps, to avoid scandal. Others thought the worst had happened, that the child had been killed and disposed of before dawn. Both explanations were terrible, but both fit within the cruel logic they knew too well. And yet, neither explanation felt complete. One woman, older than the rest and respected for her wisdom, said very little. She listened more than she spoke. When pressed, she only said that some children were born already belonging to silence, and that such births carried consequences. No one asked her to explain further. Days passed, then weeks. The mistress eventually emerged from her room, thinner, paler, her eyes shadowed as if sleep had abandoned her entirely. She walked the halls as though they were unfamiliar, flinching at sudden sounds, pausing often to listen. She avoided the enslaved women who had been present at the birth, dismissing them from her sight whenever possible, but she did not escape them completely. They saw the way her hands trembled when she held a teacup, the way her gaze drifted toward empty spaces, lingering as if something unseen stood there. They heard her wake screaming in the night, calling out words that made no sense to those listening outside her door. Once, late in the evening, one of the women passing through the hallway heard the mistress speaking in a low, urgent voice. Thinking she was addressing someone else, the woman paused, only to realize the mistress was alone in the room. "I did what you asked," the mistress whispered. "You promised." There was no reply, or perhaps there was one too soft to be heard. The house servant who had been left alone with the mistress and the child that night did not remain long afterward. Within days he was sent away to another property owned by the master, without explanation. No one was permitted to speak to him before he left. His absence only deepened the unease. He had been the last person known to be with the child. Among the enslaved quarters, the story began to take shape, not as a single narrative, but as overlapping fragments. Someone. He had seen the servant carrying a bundle toward the back of the house before dawn. Someone else claimed to have heard movement beneath the floor later that same night. Another swore they saw the mistress standing at the top of the cellar steps, staring down into darkness long after the house had gone quiet. Fear does not need certainty to grow. It thrives on absence, on unanswered questions. Children were warned away from the house after dark. Elders muttered prayers when passing certain doors. The air itself seemed altered, heavier in places, as though holding on to something it had no intention of releasing. And always, beneath every whispered theory, lay the same unspoken truth. Whatever had been born that night had not simply disappeared. It had been deliberately removed from the world in a way that left no trace, or so someone had hoped. But traces do not always take the form of evidence. Sometimes they take the form of unease that refuses to fade. Sometimes they take the form of a house that no longer rests. And sometimes they take the form of sounds, soft, deliberate sounds, that begin to echo through the night, just beyond the reach of explanation. By the time the enslaved people realized that the house itself seemed to be listening, it was already too late to pretend that nothing had happened. The silence had become something else entirely. It had begun to watch back. The house did not announce its secrets all at once. It revealed them the way rot reveals itself in wood, slowly, subtly, through signs easy to dismiss until they could no longer be ignored. After the silence learned to watch, it began to shape itself into something more defined, something that pressed against the edges of explanation and refused to stay there. It started with the enslaved children. They were the first to react, as they often were. Children noticed changes adults trained themselves to overlook. They lingered less in the shade near the house. Games that once drifted close to the back steps shifted farther away without anyone needing to instruct them. When asked why, they shrugged or said the air there felt tight, like breathing through cloth. One boy claimed he heard someone whisper his name beneath the floorboards and ran crying into the yard, refusing to go back inside, no matter how sharply he was scolded. At night, sounds began to take shape. Not the random creaks of an old house settling, not the scurry of rats or the wind pressing against loose shutters. These sounds had intention. They came in patterns, 3 slow steps, a pause, then another, a faint dragging noise beneath the parlor, the soft thud of something shifting weight where no one stood. The enslaved servants who slept closest to the house noticed first that the sounds always stopped when someone investigated. Lanterns revealed nothing. Floorboards lay undisturbed. Doors remained locked. But the moment the house fell quiet again, the sounds returned, patient and unhurried. And beneath it all was something else. Not sound exactly, but presence. A feeling of being observed that crept along the skin, raising gooseflesh even in the heat of summer. It was strongest near the cellar door. The cellar had always been an unpleasant place. Dark, damp, packed earth underfoot instead of proper flooring. It stored root vegetables, preserves, and items no longer wanted upstairs. But after the birth, people avoided it more deliberately. The air there grew colder than it should have been, even at midday. Candles burned low and uneven, their flames bending toward the floor as if pulled by something unseen. One woman, sent down reluctantly to fetch supplies, later said she heard breathing behind the walls, slow, steady, and far too controlled to belong to an animal. She dropped the basket and fled, earning punishment she accepted without complaint. Nothing would have convinced her to return. Whispers sharpened into theories. Some believed the child had been born, deformed, hidden away to avoid shame. Others believed the mistress had known long before the birth that something was wrong, that this was not a child meant to be seen by the world. A few spoke more carefully, saying the baby was not wrong in body, but in timing, in circumstance, in what it represented, because rumors had begun to surface that the child did not cry, because it did not need to. One enslaved woman swore she had seen small footprints in the dust near the cellar steps, too small for an adult, too deliberate for an animal. Another claimed she glimpsed a pale shape at the end of a hallway late at night, standing perfectly still, watching as if curious rather than afraid. The most disturbing detail, repeated again and again in hushed voices, was this: when people sensed the presence, it did not feel mindless. It felt attentive, as though something was learning. The mistress deteriorated alongside these developments. Her attempts to maintain control grew more frantic, less effective. She ordered doors nailed shut, then demanded they be opened again days later. She forbade anyone from entering certain rooms, then stood staring into those same rooms for hours, trembling. She grew furious when servants asked practical questions and hysterical when they did not. Her sleep vanished almost entirely. Dark circles hollowed her eyes. She startled at the smallest noise, clutching at her chest, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Once, in a moment witnessed by several enslaved workers, she struck a mirror with such force that it shattered, leaving her bleeding and sobbing on the floor. "He watches me," she cried, "even when I close my eyes." No one asked who she meant. The absence of the child became more noticeable than its presence ever could have been. In a society obsessed with lineage, heirs, and inheritance, a birth followed by nothing was a wound that refused to close. Visitors were turned away. Questions were deflected. Excuses piled up thinly, and still, no one spoke of the night directly. One evening, long after sunset, an enslaved man tasked with maintaining the house claimed he heard laughter, not loud, not joyful, but soft and measured, like someone testing the sound. It came from beneath the floor, directly below the mistress's chambers. When he pressed his ear to the wood, the laughter stopped. When he pulled away, it resumed. He did not sleep after that. What terrified those who whispered among themselves was not the idea that the child might be alive somewhere within the house. It was the idea that it had never been a child in the way they understood children to be, that it had arrived already aware of the power surrounding it, power rooted in secrecy, denial, and fear. They began to speak less of death and more of containment. Perhaps the child had been hidden, not buried. Perhaps it had been sealed away rather than destroyed. Perhaps the mistress believed she could control what she had brought into the world by refusing it acknowledgement, refusing it a name. But names are not the only way things are known. As weeks turned into months, the sounds grew bolder. Footsteps moved closer to occupied rooms. Doors rattled softly at night, testing their hinges. The cellar door, once nailed shut, was found unlatched more than once, despite no sign of forced entry. And always, the presence lingered just out of sight, as if waiting. The enslaved elders began performing quiet rituals in the quarters, prayers half-remembered, gestures passed down through generations. They did not speak of banishing or confronting. They spoke only of protection, of keeping boundaries, of acknowledging that some things, once brought into the world, could not be undone. The child that should not exist had left its mark, not through action, but through implication, through the way people moved differently, slept less, spoke more carefully, through the way the house itself seemed to lean inward, listening, learning. The habits of those inside it, and beneath all of it lay the same unresolved truth. Whatever had been born that night had not been erased. It had simply been placed where it could grow unnoticed, fed by secrecy, sustained by fear, and shaped by the silence that was meant to suffocate it. Instead, the silence had given it room to breathe, and soon it would demand more than whispers. Silence, once established, rarely remains empty. It gathers weight, it accumulates meaning. And in the house where the child had been born and unmade in the same breath, silence became a presence as real as any living soul. It pressed into corners, settled into stairwells, and lingered in rooms long after people had passed through them. The plantation still functioned, still obeyed the rhythms imposed upon it, but the house itself had slipped out of alignment with ordinary time. What disturbed the enslaved servants most was not any single incident, but the pattern that began to emerge. The sounds did not come randomly. They came at specific hours, most often just before dawn, when the night thinned and the world hovered between sleep and waking. At that hour, the house seemed to hold its breath. Lamps dimmed, shadows deepened, and the soft, deliberate movements beneath the floor resumed. The cellar door became the center of unspoken attention. It was old, heavy, its hinges corroded by years of damp air. The mistress ordered it sealed again after the second time it was found unlatched, though no one admitted to touching it. Nails were driven in, boards reinforced. The key removed entirely from circulation. For a time the sounds retreated. Then they began elsewhere. Footsteps traced slow paths through the hallways above the cellar, stopping outside bedroom doors, not pounding, not demanding, simply waiting. Those who lay awake during those moments described the same sensation, the feeling that if they opened the door, something would be standing there, not to attack, but to be acknowledged. No one opened the doors. The mistress's efforts to maintain order grew more erratic. She imposed rules that contradicted one another, changed her mind mid-command, punished servants for offenses she could not clearly describe. Her authority, once sharp and predictable, frayed into something brittle, and brittle things break loudly. She began to isolate herself, not just physically but emotionally. Her voice took on a hollow quality, as though it traveled a long distance before reaching anyone else. She stopped writing letters. She refused visitors. When the master's expected return was mentioned, she reacted with visible panic, insisting that his arrival be delayed as long as possible. "He must not see," she said once, clutching the edge of a table. "He would not understand." What there was to see, she never clarified. The enslaved people watched her carefully because they understood something fundamental. When those in power lose their certainty, everyone beneath them is placed at risk. Fear moves downward, confusion becomes punishment, and the house, already strained by what it contained, absorbed that fear eagerly. Objects began to shift. Small things at first, a chair angled differently than it had been left, a book opened to a page no one remembered turning to, a child's toy discovered in a room where no child had ever been allowed. Each incident could be explained away. Together they formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore. One afternoon, a servant sent to clean the upper rooms found muddy footprints leading from the mistress's bedroom to the far end of the hallway. They were small, bare, and they ended abruptly at the wall, as if the figure who made them had simply ceased to exist. The servant scrubbed the marks away without reporting them. Some knowledge protected no one. At night the breathing returned. Slow, steady, controlled. It traveled through the walls like a current. Those who heard it described the same chilling detail. It did not sound like someone asleep. It sounded like someone listening. The mistress's health declined rapidly. She ate little. She drank too much. Her skin took on a grayish cast, stretched thin over prominent bones. She began to smell faintly of iron and old candle wax. She spoke less, but when she did, her words circled the same themes again and again: regret, promises, bargains. "I gave what was asked," she whispered one night, unaware that a servant lingered outside her door. "I kept him hidden. I kept him safe." Her voice broke. "You said that would be enough." There was no reply, or perhaps the reply came in a form she alone could perceive. The enslaved elders grew increasingly uneasy. They had seen suffering, they had seen cruelty, they had seen madness take hold of men and women who believed themselves invincible. But this felt different. This felt like the consequences of a boundary crossed, a line drawn and erased in the same motion. Quiet warnings spread. Certain prayers were spoken only at night. Protective charms were hidden beneath mattresses. Mothers kept their children close after sunset, scolding them not for misbehavior, but for wandering too near the house. Because the house had begun to feel expectant, the master's return was announced suddenly without warning. His arrival brought a brief illusion of normalcy. He noticed his wife's condition immediately, her frailty, her agitation, the way her eyes darted to corners of rooms as though tracking movement. He asked questions. He received vague answers. He did not press too hard. Some things even powerful men preferred not to examine closely, but the house did not grant him the same courtesy. On his third night back, he woke abruptly, convinced someone was standing at the foot of the bed. He lit a candle. Nothing was there, yet the feeling persisted, heavy and unmistakable. The air felt compressed, difficult to breathe. From that night on, even he avoided certain parts of the house. The silence had changed again. It was no longer merely watchful. It was assertive, testing boundaries, pushing outward in subtle ways. A door slammed without wind. A mirror cracked overnight. A servant collapsed in the hallway, claiming something had brushed past him, though no one stood nearby. And always the cellar remained sealed, like a held breath beneath the house. The enslaved people understood what the mistress would not say aloud. Whatever had been done to make the child disappear had not undone its existence. The act of hiding had not erased awareness. It had only shifted it from the visible world to the spaces between. Silence, after all, is not emptiness. It is a container, and whatever had been placed inside this one was growing restless. Fear, when it cannot be spoken aloud, finds other ways to travel. It moves through glances held a second too long, through pauses in conversation, through the careful choice of where one stands after dark. Among the enslaved people on the plantation, the silence imposed by the house did not stop the story from spreading. It only changed its shape. The whispers began cautiously, shared only when the night was deep and the quarters were quiet. They were not spoken as accusations or conclusions, but as questions. Did you hear it last night? Did you feel the floor move? Did the air grow cold where it should not have? Each question carried an unspoken understanding. Whatever was happening was not meant for them, yet it was affecting them all the same. Some believed the child had been hidden deliberately, kept alive somewhere beneath the house. They reasoned this not out of superstition, but logic. The mistress's fear was not the fear of a woman who had lost a child. It was the fear of someone who knew the child still existed. Her vigilance, her constant listening, her frantic attempts to seal and unseal doors, these were not the actions of a grieving mother, but of a keeper. Others believed the child had been taken away at night and given to the ground, buried without prayer or marker. They spoke of restless spirits, of souls denied proper passage, yet even those who believed this struggled to reconcile it with the sounds that continued, the footsteps that paced, the breathing that paused as if waiting for acknowledgement. A third group spoke more softly, choosing their words with care. They said the child had been born carrying something that did not belong solely to flesh, that the silence surrounding the birth was not only imposed by fear of scandal, but by recognition, a recognition that some lives arrive already bound to consequence. These were dangerous thoughts, thoughts that could not be shared openly. And yet, they persisted. The elders listened more than they spoke. They had lived long enough to know that the world did not always behave as it should, and that some wrongs could not be corrected by punishment or denial. They spoke of balance, of boundaries crossed and never repaired. They reminded the younger ones that secrecy was a powerful thing, but it was never neutral. The enslaved people began to change their behavior in subtle ways. Certain hallways were avoided after dark. Certain doors were never opened alone. Children were taught not to respond if they heard their names called at night, especially if the voice sounded unfamiliar, or worse, familiar in the wrong way. One night, an enslaved man returning late from the field swore he saw a small figure standing near the edge of the yard, watching the house. He blinked, convinced his eyes were playing tricks on him. When he looked again, the figure was gone. But the grass where it had stood was flattened, as if something had been there longer than a passing shadow. Another woman claimed she heard humming, low, tuneless, and oddly deliberate, drifting from beneath the house while she worked alone in the kitchen after midnight. She described it not as soothing, but as testing, as though the sound were being practiced. No one laughed at these stories. Laughter felt inappropriate, even dangerous. What frightened them most was not the idea that something unnatural existed within the house, but that it was learning their routines. The sounds grew more precise. Footsteps followed familiar paths. Doors rattled at times when people were known to be awake. The presence seemed aware of who noticed it and who tried not to. The mistress's condition worsened alongside these developments. She became erratic, cruel in unpredictable ways. Punishments were handed out without explanation, then rescinded just as suddenly. She accused servants of watching her, of listening outside her door, of conspiring against her. Yet beneath her anger was something else, desperation. Once, during a rare moment of vulnerability, she clutched the arm of an enslaved woman and whispered, "If he comes back, it will destroy us both." The woman did not ask who she meant. She already knew. The master noticed the unrest, but chose to interpret it as insubordination rather than fear. He ordered stricter discipline, believing control would restore order. Instead, the atmosphere tightened further. Fear layered upon fear, feeding the house's strange attentiveness. The cellar remained sealed, yet the ground beneath it began to change. The soil grew damp even in dry weather. A faint, sour smell seeped upward, permeating the lower rooms. Rats avoided the area entirely, abandoning nests they had occupied for years. Something had claimed the space, and even animals seemed to recognize it. One evening, during a storm, a sudden crash echoed through the house. Servants rushed to investigate and found the cellar door splintered from the inside, boards cracked outward as though struck by tremendous force. Nothing lay beyond the door but darkness and disturbed earth. No tunnel, no body, no explanation. The mistress collapsed upon seeing it. She wept openly then, her composure finally shattered. "I try, Ed, to keep him hidden," she sobbed. "I tried to keep him quiet." Her words confirmed what many had already suspected. Whatever existed beneath the house was not an accident. It was the result of a choice. After that night, the whispers grew heavier, tinged with resignation. The enslaved people understood that they were living alongside something that could not be removed without consequences far worse than those already endured. They focused on survival, on minimizing attention, on respecting boundaries they could not see. They spoke less of the child as a child and more as a presence, something bound to the house by secrecy and fear, sustained by the denial of its own existence. And in that understanding lay the deepest terror of all, the realization that silence, meant to erase, had instead given the thing beneath the house its greatest strength. Because what is denied a place in the world does not vanish. It waits, and it listens, and it remembers who kept it hidden. By the time the cellar door splintered outward, and the mistress collapsed in full view of the servants, something fundamental had shifted. What had once been contained behind locked doors and whispered speculation now bled openly into the life of the house. The mistress did not recover from that moment. Whatever strength she had used to hold herself upright in the months following the birth had been spent, and what remained was a woman unraveling under the weight of something she could no longer pretend to control. Her decline was not sudden, but it was unmistakable. She moved through the house as if navigating unfamiliar territory, pausing often, listening, turning sharply at sounds no one else seemed to hear. Her posture changed, shoulders drawn inward, hands clasped tightly as if restraining themselves. She slept in short, broken intervals, never extinguishing the candles in her room, their flames burning low until dawn stained the windows grey. The enslaved people assigned to attend the house noticed that she no longer gave orders with confidence. Commands came out fragmented, contradicted by the next breath. She would demand silence, then panic when the house grew too quiet. She would order doors shut, then scream when she felt trapped. The very measures she took to protect herself seemed to intensify her fear. She stopped eating properly. Food was pushed around plates and abandoned untouched. Her body thinned rapidly, collarbones jutting sharply beneath her skin. Her hands trembled constantly, especially when she passed near the cellar steps. Once, while crossing the hallway above that space, she froze mid-step, her face draining of color, and whispered, "Not now. Please, not now." She remained there for several minutes before anyone dared move her. At night, her voice carried through the house. Sometimes she pleaded, sometimes she argued, sometimes she spoke in hushed, measured tones, as though negotiating terms with someone who did not need convincing. "I kept my word," she murmured more than once. "You were not meant to be seen. You were meant to be safe." Safe was a strange word to use. The servants who overheard these moments understood that safety in her mind did not mean kindness or care. It meant concealment, erasure. A life reduced to secrecy so complete it might pass for non-existence. But secrecy had turned inward. What had been hidden was now pressing outward, and the mistress bore the brunt of that pressure. Her body began to fail in ways that no one could explain. She complained of pains that migrated without pattern, crushing pressure in her chest one day, searing headaches the next, weakness in her legs that caused her to stumble on level ground. Physicians were summoned at last, but they found nothing concrete. No fever, no injury, no illness that fit neatly into explanation. They prescribed tonics and rest and left quickly, uncomfortable with the atmosphere of the house. One doctor reportedly remarked that the PLA-CE felt unsettled, though he could not say why. After that, fewer were willing to come. The master grew increasingly distant. He slept in a separate room. He avoided conversations that lasted too long. He spoke of business more than family. The house had become hostile even to him, and though he did not acknowledge it aloud, he sensed that whatever plagued his wife was not something he could command or discipline away. The enslaved people watched all of this with a mixture of fear and grim understanding. They had seen power decay before. They had seen cruelty soften into desperation, authority fracture into paranoia. But this felt different. The mistress was not merely losing control over the household. She was losing control over her own body, her own thoughts, her own sense of reality. She began to forget things, names, dates, conversations held moments earlier. She accused servants of acts they had not committed, then broke down in tears, apologizing without explanation. She wandered into rooms she had forbidden herself to enter, only to flee them moments later in terror. Once, she was found kneeling at the top of the cellar steps, her forehead pressed to the wood, whispering prayers that dissolved into sobs. When a servant approached, she lashed out violently, striking the woman and screaming for her to leave. "He knows when you listen," she cried. "He knows." The servants withdrew, shaken. That single word, "he," carried more certainty than any of her rambling explanations. As the weeks passed, the house seemed to respond to her weakening state. The sounds grew more frequent, more confident. Footsteps no longer retreated immediately when approached. Breathing lingered just outside doors. The humming returned, clearer now, carrying a strange, deliberate rhythm that echoed faintly through the floors. The mistress reacted to these changes with mounting hysteria. She barricaded herself inside her chambers, pushing furniture against the doors. She scratched symbols into the walls with shaking hands, symbols that meant nothing to those who saw them but clearly held desperate significance for her. She stopped bathing, stopped caring for her appearance. The mirror she had shattered remained unreplaced. She refused to look at her own reflection. Her body bore the cost of her mind's collapse. She developed sores that would not heal, bruises that appeared without cause. Her breathing became labored, shallow, as though the air itself resisted entering her lungs. She complained of pressure on her chest, of weight bearing down on her while she slept. "He sits there," she whispered once to no one in particular. "He just sits and watches." The master, finally alarmed, attempted to reassert control. He ordered the cellar investigated, the ground beneath the house examined. The workers found nothing conclusive. Disturbed soil, yes, but no clear chamber, no body, no tunnel. Whatever had been done carefully, deliberately, and long enough ago to blur its traces. The mistress did not improve after these efforts. If anything, she worsened. Her final days were marked by moments of clarity so sharp they frightened those who witnessed them. In these moments, she spoke plainly, without hysteria or confusion. She acknowledged what she had done without justifying it. "I thought if I never named him, he would fade," she said quietly one evening, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I thought silence could starve him." She laughed softly then, a broken sound. But silence feeds what does not belong. Her death did not come with drama, no final scream, no violent end. She simply stopped breathing one night, her eyes open, fixed on something above her bed that no one else could see. When her body was discovered, the candles in her room had burned down completely. Their wax pooled like pale scars across the floor. The house did not grow quieter after her passing. If anything, it seemed to exhale. Because the one who had worked hardest to keep the secret contained, was gone, and whatever remained beneath the house had lost its keeper. Death did not bring relief. It rarely does when something unresolved remains behind. When the mistress's body was carried from the house, wrapped in white and followed by hollow formalities, the atmosphere did not lighten. The house did not loosen its grip. Instead, it seemed to settle into a new, colder certainty, as though it had been waiting for this transition, and now accepted it as inevitable. The funeral passed with little ceremony. The master insisted on restraint, on appearances. Neighbors attended, offering condolences that felt practiced rather than sincere. No one mentioned the months of isolation, the unexplained illness, the strange changes that had overtaken the household. The enslaved people watched from a distance, faces carefully composed, knowing that the woman being lowered into the ground carried secrets with her that the earth itself might not accept. The night after the burial was the first time the house felt truly occupied by something other than the living. The sounds returned almost immediately, but they were no longer tentative. Footsteps crossed entire rooms, doors opened and closed without pretense. The breathing that had once lingered just outside awareness now filled spaces openly, deep and measured, as though claiming them. Those who lay awake described the sensation as pressure, not physical weight, but a presence that crowded the air, leaving little room to breathe. The master felt it too. He did not speak of it, but his behavior changed. He avoided the upper floors entirely, sleeping instead in a room near the front of the house. He kept lamps lit through the night. He drank heavily. He refused to be alone in the house after dark, summoning servants under flimsy pretenses simply to avoid solitude. Yet even surrounded by people, he seemed isolated. Whatever had been bound to the house did not acknowledge him the way it had acknowledged the mistress. Its attention felt focused, directional, as if its purpose had shifted with her death. The enslaved people noticed something else as well. The presence began to move more freely. Before, it had seemed contained, tethered to specific spaces, the cellar, the hallways above it, the mistress's room. Now it drifted. Sounds came from the yard, from outbuildings, from places beyond the house itself. The ground near the foundation remained damp, but the dampness spread outward, forming irregular patches where grass refused to grow. Children spoke of seeing a small figure near the trees at dusk, always watching the house, never approaching the quarters. Mothers silenced these stories quickly, not with scolding but with fear. Some things were not meant to be called closer, The master attempted to restore order through force. He increased patrols. He demanded stricter discipline. He punished servants for imagined infractions, lashing out at the wrongness he could not name. But fear did not respond to cruelty in the way he expected. It did not retreat. It deepened. The house began to resist him. Locks jammed unexpectedly. Keys went missing. Doors stuck or flew open without warning. Once, during a fit of rage, he struck the wall with his cane and felt it splinter beneath the blow, as though hollow. He froze, staring at the damage, and did not strike again. At night he heard it, not words, not cries, but movement paced to his breathing, matching his rhythm, mirroring him. He felt watch not with curiosity, but with intent. The house was no longer simply holding something, it was hosting it. The enslaved elders began speaking more openly among themselves, no longer bothering to lower their voices as much. The danger had shifted. Whatever power governed the house now did not seem interested in punishing them. If anything, it passed them by, indifferent to their presence. That realization brought little comfort, because indifference meant unpredictability. They understood that the mistress had served as a kind of barrier, a focal point, a keeper of the secret. With her gone, the thing beneath the house no longer had a single direction for its attention. It was free to explore. Strange incidents multiplied. Livestock refused to enter certain stalls. Milk soured overnight. Tools were found arranged in deliberate patterns, moved from where they had been left. A deep impression appeared in the soil near the house, as though something had knelt there for a long time. The master began speaking of leaving, selling the property, starting anew elsewhere, but plans stalled. Buyers came and went, unsettled by the house, the land, the inexplicable sense of wrongness that followed them through the rooms. Offers fell through, excuses were made. The house would not be abandoned easily. One night, a violent storm tore through the area. Rain lashed the ground, thunder shaking the windows. During the height of the storm, a sound rose from beneath the house. Not a crash, not a cry, but a sustained pressure, like something pushing upward against the foundation. The house shuddered. Walls cracked. Servants fled into the yard, screaming. When the storm passed, the damage was visible but incomplete. The foundation remained intact, the cellar sealed. Whatever had pushed did not break free, but it had tested its boundaries. After that night, the master stopped pretending. He ordered the house sealed, the cellar buried, the ground packed down with earth and stone. Work crews labored for days, filling spaces, reinforcing foundations, erasing entrances. The enslaved people did as they were told, though many understood the futility of the effort. You cannot bury what has already been denied. When the work was finished, the house stood silent once more, too silent. The master left shortly thereafter, abandoning the property to caretakers and overseers. He did not look back. Years passed. The plantation declined. The house fell into disrepair. Nature reclaimed what human hands could no longer maintain. But the land did not forget. Travelers avoided the area. Animals skirted it instinctively. People spoke of a heaviness that settled on the chest when passing too close, of dreams that followed them afterward, dreams of narrow spaces, of being watched, of silence pressing inward from all sides. The enslaved people who remained passed the story down in fragments, careful to strip away names and details. What remained was the lesson. Some births are meant to be witnessed, some truths demand acknowledgement, and some things, once hidden, do not forgive the silence that shaped them. Whatever had been born that night had never been allowed a place in the world, and so it had taken the only place left to it, the spaces beneath, between, and within, and it was still there, waiting for memory to fade, waiting for someone else to listen. Time did what it always does to places like that plantation. It softened the edges of memory while sharpening the unease. The house eventually collapsed in on itself, its beams rotting, its roof caving under years of neglect. Vines claimed the walls. Trees grew where the parlor once stood. To the casual eye, it became just another forgotten ruin swallowed by Georgia soil. But land does not forget what it holds. It remembers pressure. It remembers weight. It remembers what was forced into it and never given a name. People who came later never learned the full story. They only knew fragments, that the land felt wrong, that animals avoided it, that storms seemed to linger longer over that stretch of ground. Farmers who tried to work the soil there complained that crops failed no matter what they planted. Foundations cracked without reason. Wells dug too close produced water that tasted metallic, bitter, impossible to drink. No official record explained why. County histories mention the plantation only briefly, noting it decline after the mistress's death and the master's sudden departure. There was no mention of a birth, no mention of a missing child, no mention of the enslaved people who had witnessed the night that changed everything. On paper, the story ended neatly. In reality, it never ended at all. Oral memory preserved what ink refused to hold. Elders passed the story quietly, not as a warning meant to frighten, but as knowledge meant to protect. They taught children to pay attention to places that felt heavy, to listen when the air grew still without reason, to trust discomfort even when logic offered no explanation. They said some silences were not empty, they were occupied by truths that had been denied their proper shape. Generations later, people still reported dreams after passing through the area, dreams of confinement, dreams of being unseen but aware, dreams where silence pressed so tightly it became painful. Many dismissed them as coincidence. Some did not. What lingered most powerfully was not fear, but presence. Those sensitive to such things described the same sensation again and again, not anger, not sorrow, but awareness. As though something remained rooted there, not wandering, not restless, simply existing in the only space it had ever been given. It did not cry out for justice. It did not seek acknowledgement. It simply endured, shaped by the conditions of its beginning. The enslaved people had understood something that history often refuses to admit. Denial does not erase reality. It transforms it. When a life is forced into secrecy so complete that it is never allowed to exist openly, it does not vanish. It becomes something else. Something bound not to name or memory, but to place. The child born that night was denied everything that gives a person shape: recognition, care, witness, even death in the proper sense. What remained was neither fully alive nor properly gone. It was a consequence made permanent by silence. And silence, when sustained long enough, becomes a structure. The land became that structure. Even now, long after the last stones of the foundation crumbled, people avoid lingering there. They cannot always say why. They just feel watched. Not hunted, not threatened, simply noticed. As though the ground itself were aware of footsteps and weighing whether they belonged. Some claim that on certain nights, when the air is thick and the world feels close, you can hear something beneath the soil. Not digging, not knocking, just breathing, slow, steady, patient. The sound of something that has learned to exist without being seen. Historians will tell you that countless stories like this were never recorded, that births went undocumented, that lives were erased by design, that silence was often the final tool of control. They will tell you this in numbers, in abstractions, in careful language meant to soften the truth. But stories like this resist abstraction. They remain specific, rooted, heavy. They remind us that history is not only what survives in ink and ledger, it is what lingers in land, in memory, in the unexplainable discomfort that rises when we step too close to truths we were never meant to know, but were never meant to forget either. The mistress believed she could erase a mistake by refusing it a place in the world. The master believed he could bury consequences under stone and soil. The records agreed with them. The land did not, because some things do not require belief to exist. They only require silence. And silence, once given long enough, becomes a home. If this story stayed with you, if it unsettled you, lingered in your thoughts, or made you feel the weight of what history leaves behind, subscribe to Midnight Epoch, hit the bell icon, and leave a comment telling us how interesting and haunting this story was for you. These stories are not meant to fade when the video ends. They are meant to follow you, because the past is never as distant as we like to be. Leave, and some silences are still listening.